pressure. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PR Week, PRWeek's weekly podcast for everything going on in the worlds of PR and communications. My name is Frank Washkuch. I'm the news editor at PRWeek, and I'll be with you for the next 15 or 20 minutes when we talk to Wendy Salomon of the Harris Poll. Wendy, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And so you are down from the Finger Lakes region.
I am, all the way from Ithaca, New York.
Not quite wine time yet.
No.
A few more months. And Diana Bradley is with us, stepping in my usual sidekick role this week. How are you, Diana?
I'm great, thank you.
Good deal. So, Wendy, talk to us a little bit about the Harris Poll, and what is it for those people that might not be as familiar?
So the Harris Poll has been sort of a very trusted measure of public opinion for the past 50 or so years. Mm-hmm. It's almost sets the standards by which public research is done in terms of media credibility and projectability and all of those things. So, and one of the things that the Harris Poll does is the reputation quotient, which is just released, and that is our, what we call the RQ study, and we've had the gift of measuring that for the past 18 years, and that is a program that measures the corporate reputation, equity, and risk of the most visible 100 companies in America.
Mm-hmm. Just to step back for a second, going back into the Harris Poll's history, traditionally, did it measure politics? Did it measure corporate reputation? Like
well, our lineage comes from lots of different places.
Okay.
So we had Lou Harris coming in. Richard Worthlin is part of our acquisition and our profile. So we have had a long history of engaging in public issues. And I think when we think about reputation, that's part of where it all comes together, right? So it's about these social issues. It's about understanding that in a corporate context. So the Harris Poll has never shied away from issues that matter at the time, and certainly in the interesting times that we're in. We're finding ourselves measuring things around social issues, political issues, and that intersection of how companies operate.
There's a lot of that now.
Yeah, it's a really sort of tricky time. Yeah. So.
Let's come back to that specifically, but tell us a little bit about the reputation quotient. It's new. What surprised you this year?
Well, I think what surprised me this year is a few different things. Number one, this talk of this tricky time, right, and how we all feel the sands are shifting. I think that partially that's true. We saw some things that are interesting that we can touch on later. But I think, a lot is the same. The most trusted companies in America, the highest reputation companies in America are highly trusted, right? And so I think even during this time when we're all sort of struggling and trying to understand which way's up and which way's down, we really can look at some of our most stellar corporations and say, you know what, they are doing what they do best. They're continuing to do it with whatever backdrop we have. They still earn our trust. And so there's almost a consistency there that I think this year has been an interesting angle to talk about.
What's an example of, let's say, a top 5 company on the reputation quotient, and why do you think they do a good job?
Well, I mean, Amazon is number one again this year. They're also number one last year. But they also, in our 18 years of measuring corporate reputation, and it's been consistent across all that time. So we have the gift of cross-sector and over time sort of having that common yardstick. We've never had a company score higher on all dimensions. And so I think what's really important about those top performing companies, so be it Amazon or Google or any of those, I think what we find is that they're delivering on all cylinders. It's really tempting for companies to invest in their products and services. I mean, they've got great features, they've got marketing dollars, they've got all of that. But what we see these companies doing is really telling that bigger story, really opening themselves up and saying, I'm going to talk about corporate character. I'm going to, so RQ measures things around how they are as an employer. How are they in relation with the environment? How are they in relation with the local communities, et cetera? So it's not just about product and visionary leaders, right? It's about that broader perspective. And I think the highest performing companies clearly are delivering on all cylinders.
How important is it to have a company myth, so to speak? When you think of Amazon, you think of Jeff Bezos, and a lot of people know how we founded the company and things like that. I think a lot of the same could be said for Google.
I think a lot could be said, but I also think that if I think about who has the reputation problems, it's CEOs, generically speaking. One of the most really, to me, compelling pieces of data in a really rich body of research was the fact that 50% of Americans, that's like every other person, right, doesn't just feel that CEOs don't have a good reputation, but nor do they feel that it's sort of benign and neutral. They feel that CEOs have a terrible reputation, like a bad reputation, right? So my sense is that sometimes these myths, you need to be seen as having a broad bench. I think the myths are important, and we certainly see There's an increase in understanding who CEOs are. There's an increase in, I think there's some pressure for companies to step up and say, okay, I'm gonna have to sort of open myself up a little bit, right, and talk about our leaders and talk about where we came from, particularly if it's happening in an authentic and consistent way. But there's also the idea of when it's a single person, that's a lot of risk in one basket.
Sure.
And I think these days what we're seeing companies doing, and what I sort of predict for the future, is that companies will be increasingly trying to say, how do I spread that risk? How do I, when I tell my story or when I take a stance, what's the role of industry associations and all that, right? What's the role of maybe a partnership with an academic institution? How can I almost neutralize some of the potential risk of me taking a stance or a position, particularly in these highly charged times? So I think we'll see some more of that.
So you mentioned Amazon has a record high score.
Yeah.
Also, that happened, though, during a year in which it had that story appear about it in the New York Times,
right,
about hard-working conditions,
right,
overworking employees. How come that did not seem to ding their reputation?
That actually happened a little bit prior to the 2016 RFQ, so we did see some dips, so the chronology there is a little off. But this year we see a very broad-footed success for Amazon. So we did see some dip last year when that was more fresh. I think part of what we find in corporate reputation is there is an ability for strong companies to restore their reputation quite readily. Okay. And so, I know you're asking about the high-performing companies, but I think it's also interesting to think about those who
we'll get to that.
Who tanked, yeah.
So
there's the other side of that.
Right. Tech is very prominently featured in your top companies. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that obviously tech plays a role in our lives, right? Tech as an industry, we sometimes think about company reputations, right, of individual players within a sector, and then you think about an industry's reputation. As an industry, the tech sector sort of sets the bar, right? Auto companies, they want to be technology companies. Technology companies make things, but boy, you look at manufacturing and how manufacturing as an industry is looked at versus tech companies. Tech is just sort of wherever it really does set the sort of the high watermark there. So I think as an industry, it's changed our lives in ways that has really made a difference. We give the benefit of the doubt to some of those companies who play that role in our lives, and I think we see that playing back. So you've got Google, you've got Apple, you've got Amazon, although Amazon, of course, being sort of sectorless, who knows what that is? It's a little bit of everything. So I think tech companies are very highly regarded individually, but then also as an industry level. So you do see some of the broad.
How important is innovation, or at least the reputation that you are out there working hard and innovating and bringing out new things?
I think innovation varies by sector. First thing I'll say is that what matters to reputation is extraordinarily personal. It varies by sector, varies by country, varies by individual company. You bring your own history, right? So reputation is cumulative, right? So it's the rolled up of all of that stuff. And then we want to say, well, what has the ability to drive my reputation? If I had $1 in a day, right, what should I say about myself? That's what CorpCom folks are asking. That's what PR partners are trying to figure out and help them activate. But I think that when you think about innovation, that varies more in some sectors than others. I think that I'd like to invite us to think about innovation more in terms of visionary thinking, right? Sort of because what we have seen, and we're in a very privileged position at Harris to have the ability to look at what drove reputation 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago. We've had a dedicated practice for a long time. And we see that the thing that has gained in weight has a larger share of ability to make a difference in protecting against risk and in sort of building reputational equity is the idea of vision and leadership, right? So I think it's not about innovation, but it's about are you bringing us to where we're going next? And are the people that you have in those top level seats, back to the CEO prominence issue, are they actually creating a permission for us to be something bigger? So that's another reason I think why companies are going out there more with their C-suite and trying to create a little bit more of that myth, right? But in an authentic way.
Okay. Now, if we're here a few months after the Trump election, almost a year after Brexit, there's still a lot of media reports about companies creating humanless workforces or moving in that direction where you have technology taking the place of human jobs. Is that something that they should worry about looking forward?
I don't see, I'm trying to figure out how to answer that. I don't really feel that is a large part of what we see in RQ. Remember, this is the general public, right? So we see the idea of who you are as an employer, right? how you contribute to your communities, the economic contribution that you as a company deliver. That continues to be important. It's important in the U.S. It's important outside the U.S. as well. We see that actually driving a bit more in emerging markets actually than here. I think that when you look at sectors within the public, that's a different, the public isn't a monolith. And so certainly when we look at things by party, we're going to probably see a different prioritization of those types of things. Right now, I think that the friction that that topic introduces into the reputation landscape is obviously going to be sector specific, right? Where your big employers, where your workforce physically is, where your taxes are physically paid.
Interesting. Okay, Wells Fargo, big drop.
Yeah, big drop.
Tell us what.
Unprecedented drop. Come on, add a little drama there. So last year, if we were sitting here, it would have been Volkswagen. Volkswagen, we got to say largest drop ever year over year.
Right.
And we all know sort of the situation there. This year, that dubious honor now falls to Wells Fargo. So in our 18 years of measuring reputation, again, in a consistent way, Wells Fargo dropped to more than we've ever seen a single company drop due to the crisis. And, I think what's interesting is that we took some time and we wanted to understand from the public, are all issues equal, right? So do things have equal likelihood of creating risks and like toxicity to your reputation? And what we find is that the notion of malfeasance, the notion of intentional wrongdoing, which was like the Volkswagen story, right? Very premeditated, is tops the list. I mean, you could have the individual behaviors of one employee, or you could have a product recall. Those things people are far more forgiving of that. I think when you think about Wells Fargo, it becomes about how systemic it was, right? So it's not just about, the actual, the falsification and all of those things themselves, but it was how far flung it was, and how consistent it was. And I think the public has just played that back. It's not just on the emotional appeal, ethical side of our RQ formula where we saw a drop. I mean, it was a sinking tide across all dimensions. So a very broad-footed.
And it was financial sector, which, is less than 10 years from a major crisis.
That's exactly right. I mean, we have seen that sector recovering, right? We've seen the reputation of the industry increasingly slow, steady slog up a hill in terms of rebuilding reputation equity. And some, I think, companies within that have fared better. Wells Fargo actually always led that sector, right? Compared to B of A or compared to some of the other sort of bigger national banks.
Yes, a friend of mine once referred to Wells Fargo as the least evil of the big banks, which is a bit blunt, but you can, if you look back at the financial crisis of 2008, you can see why someone would say that.
Right. And actually, regional banks, by the way, are the golden child in that sector, right? But I think financial services, I would put that in the same category as pharma, which is, these are institutions and these are sectors that really improve our quality of life, right? And they're not being given credit. And so I think it becomes, not just for Wells Fargo in the context of this crisis, but it becomes an interesting discussion in these sectors for CorpCom and for their agency partners to say, how can we get more credit? Like, we play a very valuable social role. We unlock a lot of value for individuals and for families.
So if you're Wells Fargo, what do you do next?
Well, I think they're pretty far down that road, right? So what they're doing. I think what we see in most of these crisis situations is that there's expectations of transparency, right? There's expectations of accountability. There's expectations of some sort of restitution. And so all of those things are being played out. And I think really right now the ball is in the marketplace's court. I think we also find that during times of crisis where you're in places where you may be investing in a product portfolio and marketing and traditional marketing to create a brand and to create sort of a consumer transaction, like to get more people to buy your stuff or to use your services. In times of crisis, we often see more of those funds going up the organization, right, to tell a corporate story, to start to say, okay, it's really time for us to prioritize this bigger picture thing and what we represent. So you see more spending on reputation type messages versus other messages.
That's interesting. So you mentioned last year Volkswagen was the big dropper.
How
did they do this year?
They actually regained half of their loss. So they're still vilified, still the least in the sector, but we do see that restoration. We do see that forgiveness, and Volkswagen has gone through a lot of that journey in America. Now, obviously, that's a global story, and the restitution hasn't been consistent around the world, and so I think part of.
But when you mention restitution, they're certainly paying out a lot of money. What about a company like Samsung? Which literally had phones blowing up.
Right.
Which is
every time you're on a plane, you get reminded of
that. Very unusual circumstance.
Of course. So Samsung. So this happened. So Samsung on what day is what we'll ask, right?
Okay.
So Samsung at that point was when we were talking about the product challenges, right? When our data was collected. I consider this, and we did see a drop. We saw a 9-point drop. It was a pretty big drop, so clearly, and again, we saw a broad-footed decline. People weren't just saying, "Oh, now I think less of you in the product space," but I somehow trust you less. Right? I somehow think that you're less responsible as a corporate citizen, right? So you start to see the impact of something like that on the overall story. Now, this doesn't even take into account bribery and corruption and some of the stories that are circulating now. And so when I say that reputation is cumulative, that's part of it.
Okay, the big question.
Oh my gosh.
How much does this matter to the bottom line? When you look at Samsung's last public earnings, they did very well.
Yep.
When you look at how many sales Volkswagen did last year, they did very, very well despite everything.
Yep.
How much does it matter in the long run?
I'd like to invite us to think beyond consumers.
Okay.
Right? So I think that why we build our reputation and why we care about these things is not just so you'll buy my product. If you asked about innovation, what our clients tell us is that what they need their reputation most to do is to have them be seen as a good employer. If I can't remain innovative, if I can't get the top talent to work for me, and maybe I'm not in the sexy tech industry, maybe I sell heavy things in boxes, I don't know, but I need to be seen as a good employer. I need policy influentials to give me a seat at the table so that next innovation, the permitting process is easier, or whatever the case may be. So reputation matters extensively in those environments. So certainly as a business asset, we manage our supply chain, we manage our HR. So increasingly companies are just very much realizing that to manage a corporate reputation is just part of what's smart.
Okay. Yeah. All right, interesting stuff. Let's move to the next topic. Big Tuesday night speech, joint session of Congress by President Donald Trump. What were your impressions?
Well, I think, through my reputation lens, I'll say that part of what some of our best performing companies do is they're consistent, right? So they're predictable in a certain sense. So I think obviously the change of tone that we saw was something that the question on the table now is very clearly, which is real, so this idea of authenticity, this idea of the continuity of your thing. So I think right now the question becomes, how will that lower tone, that more reasoned tone, will that last? And I think part of the issues that were raised in that speech are what businesses are struggling with all the time, right? So what they're struggling with is, do I put my head above the tree line? Do I actually take a stance on it? In the RQ study, we did something new this year. Interesting times call for interesting measures. We actually broke the data by political party. And we said, does it matter if I'm a Democrat or a Republican how I think about companies? And the answer is, in some cases, yes. And when it matters the most is when those companies have chosen to take a stance. And so Republicans' #1 rated company, better than Amazon, better than J&J, better than sort of Fabric of America, is Chick-fil-A.
Okay.
Right? And Hobby Lobby, that's another one that differentiates itself in terms of having a stronger reputation. Meanwhile, in terms of Democrats, Target is a company that actually Democrats tend to see more favorably. So in all those cases, those are companies that have chosen to take a stance. And so, the Trump speech I think is interesting because it raises so many issues that businesses are really struggling with. Do I take a stance? What we found is that there's clear risk and there's clear reward.
And it's interesting, the 3 companies you just mentioned, those are culture war issues that they have taken a stance on. What about a company like Nordstrom's?
Well, we saw their stock do fine. I think a company like Nordstrom's, it's in the same pocket. Obviously, it's not on our most visible list, but I don't see it particularly being any different. Part of the thing is these companies have proactively shared their values versus being poked, right? So the idea is, are you being reactive or not? And I think what's really interesting there is the role of the media, right? Because you're gonna take your stance and you're gonna actually practice that stance. You're gonna have a very clear corporate story on your stance, right? And then there's going to be the fact that it's left out there for someone else to tell that story. And we recently collaborated with Harvard in the Harris poll on a study. And we again, by political party, there's things that people want. People want more collaboration, regardless of party. The majority want that. People wouldn't mind fewer tweets, regardless of party, right? Both parties want that. But where we saw the biggest divide, a mandate from both sides, we asked a question, who do you trust more, Donald Trump or the media? Democrats, 80-some% said the media. Republicans, 90-some% said Donald Trump. I mean, so this is the, here we have it, right? So when we're relying on the media to do these things, I think it's a really interesting challenge for agencies, for CorpCom people to say, okay, I've crafted this story, I've taken my stance in such a careful way, but in this environment, I think it just adds a level of risk and unpredictability.
Diana, what was your impression of the speech, or the day after, the aftermath, so to speak?
I agree. I think that his tone was very mature in comparison to previous speeches he's done and just public engagements. And he did sound, dare I say, presidential. And he even opened his speech with, finally responding to the anti-Semitism in the country and saying that, he condemns the hate and evil. So in that way, I think, he had a strong, it was strong for, in comparison to his past. But I saw a lot of people on social remarking that he wasn't really saying anything new. The main thing was his tone. So I thought that was interesting, that it's all about delivery sometimes when it comes to this kind of thing.
Wendy, you mentioned the role of the media in this, and trust of the media differing between Republicans and Democrats. One thing that I thought was really interesting, as somebody who consumes a lot of news, and usually very early in the morning, is that you had, I think, easily the best news cycle of his presidency so far, in the 24 hours or so, almost 24 hours after the speech. And then immediately you have the NBC News story about how no real intelligence came out of the Yemen raid, even though he said otherwise. And then you have, the Times story about
the Russia stuff.
All of the Russia stuff combined. And so there's a really interesting dynamic setting up. Do you think that he's going to be able to keep that consistency of message with all of these things swirling at the same time?
I would say that that was the inconsistent message, and I think he will be very consistent with what he has been for the rest of his career, right? So it's like which Donald Trump shows up sort of thing, right? And so I think that, yesterday, the news cycle was very interesting, was not in his favor. So I think that what we'll find is that he is back to who he is, and that's back to the authenticity. I mean, this is what sort of CEOs and companies struggle with as well, right? How do we sort of be true to who we are? And I think that if history is a predictor of the future, we would say that actually that speech was the aberration, right? And that sort of normal tone. And I love the whole idea of content versus relational message. And it wasn't about the content; it was about how he said it. And so we'll see if he maintains that.
All right, let's get on to the non-political stuff, which is the Oscars, which is not really all that non-political. So, your PricewaterhouseCoopers, the morning after.
What a bad day.
Yeah, tell me your thoughts.
My thoughts are, I mentioned that we think about how important various crisis, situations are. I think this is a guy named Brian, right? Okay. And there was Emma Stone, and that dress was super pretty, and he was tweeting. And I think it's a guy who grabbed an envelope, and, do I think that this is embarrassing? Yes, it's embarrassing. Do I think that it won't go away because I'm already squirming at what the Oscar host next year will make the jokes about it? It's just going to be, you could imagine, right? It's just not going to die. But, this is a highly respected institution. Right. Their clients are extraordinarily ingrained with their clients. You can't just sort of pull apart these relationships. I don't see much risk there other than it's just embarrassing. The human error of one guy is nothing more than
But we know who Brian is now.
I know, it's a guy named Brian.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for Brian.
I know, I thought the same thing.
You know who I thought actually came out of it looking very good was the actors and staff of the film La La Land.
I agree
they were just very gracious.
They were very gracious.
Normal, for lack of a better term.
With the cameras running. And with that, imagine, who could even imagine, right? Imagine sort of how fired up you are, and then you're like, whoops.
They're actors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
I guess they were very good at that. Who were the other winners of the night?
Oh gosh, my whole family would laugh because I'm not a movie person. I would say
Okay.
Red Vine.
Red Vine.
I would say
Okay.
Red Vine.
What do you think, Diana?
In terms of what?
Well, you talked to Red Vine, so
I did.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the story actually when I talked to them. So, if you didn't catch the Oscars,
Literally catch.
yes. There was parachutes that came down from the ceiling that had bags of candy attached to them. It was one of the biggest stunts of the night. And the candy involved was Junior Mints, Red Vines, and Mike and Ike. They did not know that their brands would be involved. And so I spoke with Red Vines about this. They said that they had no plan at all. They weren't even paying attention. The marketing director told me that when this actually happened, she had it paused and she was putting her kids to bed.
Yeah.
So she called their social media person and said, we have to jump on this.
Yeah.
So it was really one person that dealt with this.
If you're going to get called to work on a Sunday night, it might as well be
that's
something
kind of
like
a
that.
fun thing,
I think it's worth it in that case.
Yeah, so they were just retweeting, what celebrities were saying about it, videos, that kind of thing. They made a GIF. So yeah.
It's interesting in that they weren't prepared, but that's kind of okay, I think, in a lot of ways nowadays. Like if you go back to, I keep going back to Tic Tacs during the presidential election, which of course was in the Access Hollywood video, and not such a great way. But Tic Tac was so quick to, say they didn't condone the comments in the video and things like that. And if you're Tic Tac, how are you possibly prepared for a situation like that?
Yeah.
But I guess everybody has to be nowadays.
Yeah,
But it's kind of incredible. Junior Mints did a letter, I want to say?
It was Mike and Ike.
Mike and Ike, I'm sorry, yes.
They did a letter.
You can tell I'm not a big candy person.
They did a letter, apparently during the show, Sonny Pawar, an actor in the film Lion,
Right.
I think. He and Jimmy Kimmel were having a discussion about candy, so they made a custom box called Jimmy and Sonny.
Yes. Yes. Was that when he was lifted up like the
Yes,
the
like the Lion King.
Which is the only, as you know, I have never seen The Lion King, and I might be the last person on earth to have never seen The Lion King. And that's the only scene where I know what anybody's talking about with The Lion King with that. The baby Simba scene, I think everybody will know what we're talking about.
Right.
Okay, so more seriously though, if you are a major Fortune 500 client, PricewaterhouseCoopers, does this change your thinking at all, do you think?
No, I don't think it does.
No?
No, I think it's sort of an anecdote. I don't know.
Okay.
During a game of golf, I don't think it's a big deal.
So if you're PwC, if you can stand the jokes, you're pretty much okay. Right?
Exactly. It's just next year's Oscars are just going to be so, they're going to mention it a million times.
And you would have to think whether it's candy brands or whatever the case is, everybody is going to be ready to be mentioned in a weird, unconventional parachuting from the ceiling kind of way, right?
And I think it's interesting because actually there it's about seizing opportunity, right? So it's about, wow, we have this really salient moment. How can we execute that for our brand and sort of build value for the company? Now, the Tic Tac example is a little bit different, right? How do we neutralize something? But both demonstrate certainly the need for, the 24/7, the always on, all of that. And to have, when you think about what you need to have in your bag of tricks in case of God forbid or in case of, even something positive like this, you need to be ready. So it really changes, I think, how companies and how their agency partners are thinking about readiness for things like this.
I have to say, I had never heard of Red Vines before the Oscars, and then I had to ask what they were.
And we're talking about it.
Right.
Actually, they've been having some trouble with some media outlets misreporting and saying that Twizzlers fell from the ceiling.
Oh.
So they've had to correct, I think Good Morning America, they corrected them on social, and they were like, we'll send you a pack of Red Vines, so they've been doing that as well.
But again, sounds like a bit of an opportunity to do
right.
that too. All right, Wendy, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure having you on the PR Week. This is about all we have time for, but we will see you again next week on the PR Week podcast. Thanks again.